Hello, this is Jane from empowermefirst.college, and today I'm going to introduce the first unit of the second semester of the English literature syllabus, and it will be about creative writing. Now, last semester you looked at speeches and slam poetry, and you produced your own speech or poem at the end of that, and you looked at short stories as well. And this semester, we're going to be looking at different written pieces of literature, just different short stories, and at poetry. And we'll work our way towards you producing your own piece of creative writing. You'll be writing a short story yourself. So before you can produce a piece of creative or literary writing, it's a good idea to look at the features of literature and come up with a definition of what literature is. And as you'll see, this question is more complicated than you might first think. Does it mostly have to do with what goes on certain shelves in the library? Or does it have to do with what kind of language is used and what different types and forms of literary writing exist? And what does all this tell us about features of creative writing? What can we learn from literature and apply in our own writing when we complete the writing task? So let's think about definitions. What is literature? Well, I found this definition in the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary. It defines literature as pieces of writing that are valued as works of art, especially novels, plays, and poems. So by valued works of art, we mean things like the classics, works that belong in the section of the library that you can see in the photo there on the top right, and that are associated with people like the man at the bottom of the screen next to my head. That's that way is William Shakespeare. And generally these words will be considered to be of superior value, long-lasting value, and we call works that belong in this category the literary canon, works that have been regarded as being of great value for a long period of time. Now that's all very well, but in recent years people have started to question what goes into the literary canon. They've started to note that a large proportion of what goes in the canon is written by men, often white men. And then they've noticed that the people who decide what goes into the literary canon are also often white men. Surprise, surprise. So as a consequence, in recent years, people have tried to find out about other voices and other pieces of literature written by women, for example, and people outside of Europe and people who aren't white. And the idea is that there are other works that are also of great value, but they've been overlooked and perhaps haven't received the attention they deserved. One example of this would be Zora Neale Hurston, whose picture you can see at the bottom there. And she was an American author and an anthropologist and a filmmaker. And her most famous work, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was published in 1937. And it's about a young African-American woman who develops from a very underconfident teenage girl without a voice into a strong, empowered woman. And originally it wasn't well received, but it is now recognized as a very important novel of what was called the Harlem Renaissance, which was this fluorescence in African American culture in the 1930s, 1920s, 1930s. And it was chosen by Time magazine in its list of 100 best English language novels. And so thanks to this interest in what we call feminizing or decolonizing the canon, reading lists at universities and at schools have become a lot more diverse, and lists of nominated authors for major literary prizes have become more diverse as well. But it leaves us with the question, if we can't say that literature is the canon, because that's just arbitrary and it's been decided on by a handful of people, how do we define literature and what makes a work literary? Well, Perhaps the most thorough discussion of this question is Terry Eagleton's book on literary theory. And Eagleton is a British literary critic, and he begins with this widespread definition of literature as imaginative writing. He says that you can define it, for example, as imaginative writing in the sense of fiction, writing which is not literally true. But he notes himself that this definition is very problematic because there are plenty of types of writing out there that are not literally true. I think, for example, about fake news, made up stories like that 5G mobile devices spread the coronavirus. Many stories like this are presented to us in some media channels, and then not actually factual, but we wouldn't necessarily call them fiction either. And then what about genre of literature that are factually true? Think about biography and autobiography. These are supposedly factual accounts of somebody's life. And one of the best known works of literature, Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, is autobiographical. You may have heard of Anne Frank and her diary. It's the journal that she kept while she was in hiding for 2 years with her family during the occupation of the Netherlands by the Nazis during the Second World War. And she writes from this annex where they were hidden from the outside world. And tragically, they didn't manage to stay hidden throughout the whole Second World War. The hideout was discovered in 1944, and Anne Frank herself died of typhus in a concentration camp in 1945. So this is definitely not a work of fiction, but it's still one of the most famous works of literature in the world. And then and so, as Eagleton says in the quote on the bottom left here, a distinction between fact and fiction seems unlikely to get us very far, not least because the distinction itself is often a questionable one. How do we tell fact from fiction? There are works of historical fiction that are based on a lot of research, for example, so it's not clear. So if we can't define literature based on whether it's imaginative or fictional, as in not true, Eagleton suggests that we can perhaps define it based on the type of language that it uses. And he suggests that literary language is what he calls non-pragmatic discourse. Now that sounds very complicated, but it isn't really. What he means is language that doesn't serve an immediate practical purpose. So it's not pass me the salt, please, or anything like that. Instead, Eagleton suggests that literary language is language that is kind of trying to draw attention to itself. It's saying, look at me, what do you think I mean? I must mean something very complicated. And he also suggests that literary language is more condensed than normal communicative language, and it might be saying a lot in just a few words, and it can be understood in different ways and on lots of different levels. Now, if you look, so you can see that, in the quote there, it focuses on the way of talking rather than on the reality of what is talked about, the manner of language, the use of the language which talks about itself. If you look at the text on the right here, you might think that this is very practical. It looks like an informal note from one person to another, perhaps from a man to his wife or to his girlfriend. But it's actually a poem, and quite a famous poem. Let's read it. This is just to say I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So this person is apologizing for something, or perhaps confessing to something, to having sneakily eaten some plums from a type of refrigerator, an icebox. But it's also been read as meaning a lot more than that. It's often seen as having to do with kind of guilty enjoyment or with giving way to temptation. because fruit, after all, is often associated with temptation in the Bible, as in the story of Adam and Eve in the book of Genesis. Eve gives the apple to Adam and he eats it, and that's why they have to leave paradise. And that's also associated with sexuality very often. And I've read this with high school students, and one girl said, "It's about rape. I think he's raped her. It's a date rape." And people looked at it and said, yes, maybe that might be in there somewhere. So you can see that it is communicating a lot of different things on a lot of different levels. And there are different ways of potentially understanding it. We could also see it as just an innocent celebration of life's simple pleasures. It doesn't have to be about rape. So, literary language is language that is used in an unfamiliar or a strange way to mean more than what it seems to mean at first glance. And Eagleton uses the term estrangement to describe this, but there's also another term, defamiliarization, which was used by Russian literary critics. Eagleton says that literature, if you look at the quote, transforms and intensifies ordinary language. It deviates systematically from everyday speech. That means that literary language moves away from everyday speech and makes language seem strange. It changes our perspective on language. It makes us read again and think again. But it also makes the subject or the objects that it writes about appear strange. So if you look at the poem on the right of the screen, this is quite a famous poem by Percy Bysshe Shelley, the 19th century writer, and it's about something very familiar, as you can see from the picture. It's about the moon. And let's read it. Art thou, which is an old word for you, art thou pale for weariness of climbing heaven and gazing on the earth, wandering companionless among the stars that have a different birth, and ever changing like a joyless eye that finds no object worthy of its worth its constancy. So here Shelley is addressing the moon, and he's asking it, why are you so pale? Why do you change constantly? Because the moon, of course, grows and shrinks, or we say it waxes and it wanes. And the reason that he suggests is that it's lonely. It's wandering without a companion. It's homeless, and it feels estranged from the stars with which it has nothing in common. And it changes because it finds nothing to which it owes loyalty or stability. Now, I'm sure you, like me, have looked at the moon numerous times, but I doubt that you've ever thought about the moon like that it's changing because it's lonely and restless and it feels isolated and it's constantly looking round for a companion. And this is a good example of a poetic or a literary device. I think you met this term last semester. It's called personification, which is when we give objects around us or perhaps features of the natural world human characteristics. Here it will be loneliness and restlessness. Here's another example of a poet making us look at the natural world in a different way by giving it human characteristics and infusing it with emotions. Let's read it. Let's let Earth's pain be soothed by Ni Osundari. The sky carries a boil. It's like an infected lump on the skin, a boil of anguish. Let it burst. Our earth has never lingered so dry. In the season of falling showers, clouds journey over trees and over hills, miserly with their liquid treasure. Prostrate like famished horses, brown hills cast vacant looks at balded plains, where playing kids provoke the dust in what once was the cradle of green. So here, drought or a lack of rain is associated with physical pain, and the blackness of the sky is compared to a boil. Both the sky and the land are personified here. The earth beneath The storm is given animal characteristics as well, because it's associated with hunger, with a horse, but it's also associated with hunger and need through the word famished. And the next part of the poem reads like this: Let it rain today that parched throats may sing. Let it rain that earth may heal her silence. Let it rain that roots may swell the womb of lying plains. Let it rain today that stomachs may shun the rumble of thunder. The roofs have been silent too long, the seeds noiseless in the dormitory of the soil. The earth has been lying too long and songless. Time to leap, time to lilt. Let the sky's boil of anguish burst today, the pain of the earth be soothed. So here the storm, the rain, the water are soothing, relieve pain, but they also relieve hunger, and they enable growth, reproduction. Seeds turn into plants and music plays. See, and you can see through this repetition, the let it rain, it sounds almost like the poet is praying for the clouds to burst and the rain to come. So water means an answer to prayers, but it means life, and it means the satisfaction of needs, and it means the relief of pain. It's perhaps because of this quality of poetry, this ability of poetry to make us look at things differently and with fresh eyes, that London Transport decided to post poems on underground trains. This is a cultural campaign that's been going on for a number of years now, and the 5 million people who use the underground every day have the opportunity to read poetry that's posted above their heads. You can see here this woman is sitting underneath a piece of some text, and that's a poem. I know she doesn't look very inspired, but the idea is presumably that it shocks them out of their routine a little bit and makes them look at the ordinary in an extraordinary way for a few seconds. Yes, there's an example. And they take poems from all over the world. You can see this one is Greek. So even a boring thing like their morning commute becomes slightly extraordinary, estranged, makes them look around with different eyes. So what have we looked at today? Well, we've looked at definitions of literature, and we've looked at the problems with those definitions, and we've looked at literary language and the features that characterize literary language, and particularly this idea of estrangement or defamiliarization, that literary language is saying, look at me, I'm doing something out of the ordinary. And in the next video, I'll be talking about particular types of literature, what we call genre of literature. Goodbye.